Back in closed beta, when the game first launched, nobody could buy packs. That wasn't a feature that was in the game, and the only cards you could have were the basic cards that you got from leveling up your class, and those that you had opened out of a pack that you had earned organically. That was the only way to get them. Everyone had low-level budget decks, and for me, Ariane was the first class I played, largely because of just these two cards. And this card as well, but that one's been changed since. Yep, it did used to do that. So with this in mind, at low levels and in Dungeoneering, Old Earthblast was absurd. It was a card that single-handedly defined a deck's win condition without needing any real deck-building talent or meaningful setup in a game. You could argue that there are lots of cards in the game that define many different decks' win conditions, mainly the Assassin, Dondakun's Cannon, Pulverize. These are all obvious examples, and yes, they are win conditions just like Earthblast, except Earthblast was just so much easier to do and went into just about every low-level deck because drawing a hand of 10 on any given chapter isn't nearly as difficult as stacking mass armor or gold or a big ol' weapon. You don't need to build a deck to do that, you just put in 6 draw cards and you're done. So I really like this change. Now obviously it's a nerf, and the idea they were going for was, presumably, to make it so you actually had to think about the deck it was going into. Now, you still can run creature cards in that deck, but they've got to be worth it, since they no longer synergize with Earthblast very well. Obviously, the Earthblast deck overall is now weaker, since you can't as easily run creature cards. That is a drawback, but they've compensated and made the card 2 gold cheaper. And this saving is in line with the gold removal on Haunted Soul. A few days ago before the patch, I went through all of the Ariane cards myself, and I thought about how would I change them, and I did this with a bunch of people who chipped in ideas, and one of those people was Unforgiven. Very good player, finished rank 8 last season, and him and I decided to do this video together. The opinions surrounding these cards are mostly shared, and his voice will appear later on. I reviewed most of the existing card changes, and he reviewed most of the new Morvran ones. But I mention this because Haunted Soul, Unforgiven, and we thought we'd just take 1 gold off. We thought that was what Jagex would do, but clearly they removed all of it. And the more I think about it, the more I like that. Obviously this card is still 5 damage in a single slot. That's a lot of damage. It's still okay. 5 damage is above the curve. But 2 gold on it was facilitating, even 1 gold on it would be facilitating some very potent, very refined decks that don't need to run any cards that specifically draw gold. For example, the old Pirate Ariane I did a video on, you only spent 6 gold in the entire deck to Barkatoes, Archmages, and Pirates hideouts. All very strong 1-cost cards, and when you have a deck that doesn't need to slow down at all for gold gain with Ali Morrison's in it or anything like that, these 1-cost cards are absurd. With the old Ladyzay, I did a lot of experimenting with a Pirate Raptor. Now, the nerfs have hits, this deck is a bit out of date, but the idea is there. And Goblin Brute that rewards 1 gold, I was actually very impressed with, since it's just enough for a bash or a hideout, and whilst this card isn't particularly highly rated, because Raptor isn't really known for his aggro decks, but if you could run it in the old Pirate Ariane, or any aggro deck, you would. It would almost strictly be an upgrade on Scorpion, and in my opinion, I think Haunted Soul was giving all the other aggro cards like this a bad rap, because they compared so horribly to it. I think that the 2 gold nerf is justified. And I still think the card is good. Worse than Troll Chucker, mind you, because it doesn't give any gold, but a single slot unconditional 5 damage is still above the curve in terms of power level. And because of that, it's still going to make its way into hyper-aggressive decks, along with Ring of Recoil and whatever else goes in those. Next, I'd like to talk about Archmage Cedor. So, whilst this card actually didn't receive any changes, which I was surprised about, I wanted to talk about it anyway, because myself, Unforgiven, and lots of other people, as I said, were surprised by this. We thought it was too strong. Whilst I still think that its effect is way above the curve for 1 gold, and I would have made this cost 2, the nerf on Haunted Soul does deal with this as well. I know Jagex has said before that they like to balance cards, obviously on their power level, but sometimes on how fun or satisfying they are to play, which I think is good for a game studio to do. I think Archmage is probably one of those examples. Definitely a very fun card, the moments it creates are awesome, and I like this because of the threat that it always has. You know, it inspires players to make an interesting chapter that they wouldn't normally do, to play around it, especially at higher levels where, you know, it really can damage you a lot if you get hit by it. So, overall, I'm okay with it staying the way it is for now. Let's wait and see. Ariane definitely needs some strong tools now that everything has happened, and as I mentioned, I think the Haunted Soul nerf deals with this just fine as well. Next up, Lady Heffin. This used to be one of the strongest heals in the game. and was very comparable to Full Tetsu, significantly cheaper, though sometimes harder to use if you needed to heal in a pinch. And they just made it cheaper. It just became the best heal in the game, as far as I'm concerned. The deck it goes in is worse, yes, but in a vacuum, if you're running a deck filled with 90% creatures, which, by the way, is most top-level AP sustain win in the final fight style decks, then this card is insane. Oh, but you can't run that kind of deck with Ariane Interjection. Actually, you can. I did it last season to climb into the top 10 at some point, and now that the meta's going to slow down, it's more viable than ever. I'm really looking forward to making a Revenant Dark Knight Dark Strike deck, which I'm going to use on my stream. Links in the description. Now, obviously, overall, this change is a nerf, because Heffen can no longer go in every deck, but that's a good thing. I always used to find Earth Blast and Heffen and Vengeance and Earthwave incredibly boring. I personally found them quite flavorless. I mean, Vengeance used to deal damage to your opponent equal to their total attack times 2, and dealt half of that damage to you as well, which in real RuneScape is kind of more like how it works, and has a lot more flavor for me, at least somebody who knows where it comes from and what it did in the game that it's being based on. That card, though, was very powerful, overpowered, which is why they changed it. But what they changed it to, the current version, actually left me feeling rather jaded, as it just made all of Ariane's cards look the same. Hand size this, hand size that, hand size, but no longer the case now. The Heffen change and the Earth Blast change have so much more flavor. Ariane decks are going to be way more interesting to build now. They actually do different things. Oh, I really like that, and I'm really looking forward to the variety that comes with it. And I know Ariane was hit really hard by these nerfs, but she was just so strong before that I think actually she's just being brought in line with the other legends, and that goes for Dungeoneering as well. Next up, Vengeance, which I was just talking about, so yeah, no longer deals 5 damage. Good. The card was ridiculous, and actually single-handedly made Luna's worth it on its own. And then you got all the other 3 cards as well. There's nothing else to say. Thank God for this nerf. More Spellbook cards. Smoke Barrage. Hard counters are dumb. That's my opinion. It always has been. Anything that single-handedly makes a whole deck, and therefore a significant portion of the cards in the game completely useless, was just straight up retarded. Bad game design. Limits options. Makes the meta stale. And whilst this card wasn't that prevalent, it is a change I'm happy to see, and Major Mary is definitely a card I'm still very skeptical about. By the way, Redbeard Frank, if you want to jump on what I said about hard counters and Goldzan, I do have a video about specifically just that in the Pipeworks, so don't grill me too hard. The Smoke Barrage change, though, in some ways a nerf, yes, but what it gained was 3 direct damage, which fits the theme and the rest of the cards in the Ancient Spellbook very nicely, and in some ways, because of that, is a buff. That spellbook has even more damage in it now, making it more refined. It did, though, also lose the effect of removing 2 attack from your next creature, which is very relevant, because that used to be used in combination with the Shadow Barrage, which has the same effect on it as well, to instantly take down something big, like a Yoga Shaman. So sometimes I think this card will be worse, because weapon removal can be really strong, and sometimes it'll be better because damage. Overall, though, given that it no longer removes attack, a slight nerf. Skeletal Peon. It gained 1 life. Fair enough. I didn't think this was needed either, but Jagex said on stream, if you look at Krasian Warrior, then you can make the comparison that 1 gold is equal to 5-1 in stats? Which obviously isn't the case, so overall this change does make sense when you look at it like that. But given all the other nerfs Ariane got, I think this really did tick some people off, since it seemed like such a pointless change on such an innocent card that no one ever complained about. Will it have any impact on the game, though? No. You probably weren't going to run this in your Earth Blast deck now anyway, and now that Haunted Soul doesn't give gold, your 3-attack Pirate Ariane will want to find gold from other sources, so Krasian Warrior is way more interesting than Peon, and your AP Sustain win in the final fight style deck just doesn't care at all. Long live the Peon. Zamorak and Occultist. So, I'm a bit of a meme when it comes to forgetting about Asphyxiate. I stream a lot on Twitch, and my natural reaction is to check the chat once I submit my turn, and sometimes I do miss the Occultist that they might play in their first few slots, and get spanked hard by a greater demon that I play later on. So thanks that, Jim. Funds should be available by Monday. But seriously, this change is one that I'm happy about. Occultist didn't see much play in Constructed before, but when it did, you could force your opponent into not playing any cards for several chapters. especially if they were going second. It really pinned people down knowing their opponent had it, and yes, you could play around it by putting a dinky one-attack creature before your big guy at the end, and that's good game design, I like that, but being able to do that and keep another asphyxiate in your hand, your opponent can't play around it forever, and this was an even bigger problem in Dungeoneering. In fact, that's really where the problem was. I'm not sure how much of an impact Occultist had at lower levels, but at top level, not that much. I mean, when it did see play, it was stifling, but it wasn't really that good overall compared to the other decks that were out there. Whether that would still be the case if you left it the same, I don't know. Pirate Ariane is gone, probably wouldn't change even if it was the same, but maybe in the mid-levels and the low-levels it was a big problem, and certainly it was in Dungeoneering. So based on that, obviously this is a nerf. They did reduce its stats as well to compensate, but I don't think by enough. I'd like to have seen it have one less attack, and then it'd be pretty alright card. I'd kill a 3/5 for 2 gold and draw an insane card in my aggro deck, especially now that Haunted Soul isn't a good gold option, or a gold option at all. Maybe that's why it's a 4/5 though. Maybe they tested it as a 3/5 and decided, too good. Next up, in Feeble. Now, it costs 1 gold. And I'm not sure what to say about it, except that. Obviously it's worse. It was probably done as a balancing consideration for new players, because I don't think it was that good at top level. Not really. It was pretty alright in Dungeoneering, and yes, we will update the tier list, links in the description, at some point, but let's do some testing first, see how things are before we start evaluating cards out of 10 again. I think the biggest implication of this change is not that it's more demanding on your gold, I mean it is, but the biggest thing about it is that you can no longer easily get it off on Chapter 1, at least reliably. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Unforgiven and I wanted to do this video together. We spent a long time thinking about the changes together, making notes, that kind of thing. I took most of the nerfs because I was most excited about them, and he's going to cover most of the new Morvran cards because he was most excited about them. So the rest of this video is Unforgiven, covering the remaining nerfs that I haven't touched on. We shared all of the cards between us evenly, except for Redbeard Frank and Ladyzay, which, similar to my Kaizaj tournament video, I wanted to do a whole separate discussion on. So do subscribe to his channel for the second half of this video, where him and myself talk about Morvran, links in the description. But the rest of this video, Unforgiven.
Wait, what does the new stacker even do? Well, I guess you can use it to activate your Realism's Balm, or dodge a grief card like a Dust Devil maybe. Oh, and it also activates your Wind Surge. This seems pretty good, right? It doesn't even cost anything. Well, then you really think about it, and turns out you could play many other cards instead, like Crater Demon, which does the same thing, but you also get Strike and Paid. Or if you're worried about the grief, you just bar fight their weapon. Or, you know, you penguin ship yourself down and you actually gain 5 gold, which is pretty useful. So yeah, while there are things you can actually do with this card, I think everything it does can be done better with other cards that I just mentioned, which leads to my conclusion about his card being completely useless, garbage that will see absolutely no play. Next up we have Kale, the nerf we have all been waiting for since day 1 of the game. Kale, who used to be auto-include in pretty much every deck, now looks not so good anymore. The card now has an obvious role of ramping into bigger creatures, and for that purpose it's competing with cards like Sergeant Slimetoes, which does basically the same job, but in my opinion slightly better. Now, Kale does have the advantage of not being as easy to grieve, and the armor from it is a nice bonus, but the extra reach from Slimetoes does make it that slightly better in my opinion. So the question really is, would you run Kale in addition of 2 Sergeant Slimetoes and maybe even Counter-Rainers? Honestly, I'm not completely sure. Overall, it's not the strongest card, but it just might be barely enough to make the cut to AP building decks. Anyways, at least the game has lost one must-have diamond card. Rejoice, free-to-play players. Well, Rani's Dragon definitely got a very unique and interesting effect. It's worth noting that it has been confirmed that it should not heal you if you are below 15 HP, which makes the card a bit worse. Now the use of this card comes from being able to activate your strong mortal effects like Certification and Full Tarrox, and still being effectively high HP for the final fight with the help from the armor from this and other cards you might play. It will make it hard and risky to activate your Gorge and Firewatch, since it would put you at low health and you would have to damage yourself through the armor, which can turn out to be difficult sometimes. To be honest, as cool of an effect as this is, I don't think it will be any good, and there are other ways to manipulate your health down to mortal and back. Cool card though. Black Knight Titan no longer works as a weapon removal except for Wonder ability, which means the role of the card has completely changed from a weapon removal that has the added bonus of a strike into just another strike card with a small benefit of sometimes dealing increased damage if they happen to have a weapon. It also exhausts you now, which puts it in line with all other creature-based strikes, such as Greater Demon and Black Demon. And finally, in addition to all this, it got its stat line increased. I really feel all this might have been a bit too much, and I'm not sure if it should exhaust you, or at least let it keep its old stats. I think it's good that it's no longer a hard counter card, but I do think they may have nerfed it a bit too hard.